So where it takes ages because when the lining wears out, you do not care. You patch it at first, and then eventually it wears out so much that you can simply replace it. But then, by the time the top wears out, the color will have shaded usually with the modern chromium-based dye. The worst would be a vegetable-based dye. It will fade very quickly, and that was the problem upper classes faced before 1830s, when it started establishing the chromium-based dyes, at least for the cloth of the upper classes. The upper classes were usually changing outfits so often because the color would fade away completely after a year's wear. Although they had maybe 2 to 4 outfits. So if they had worn the same outfit, probably the color would have faded after 6 months. And you could not really repigment it, because if you repigmented it, a coat is a problem because it has lining, and also it would cause a ton of problems. And it would necessitate the wool to be boiling, so it would shrink the wool, and some of their coats would be too small. So usually, because they wanted it to look bright, the colors or new, they would give it to their servants or whatever, which also explains the lack of originals from that era, because the servants, from the moment they would pass it to the servants, it would sort of say rip to the cloth itself, to the garment itself, because those people, like servants, would either themselves well it until the whole thing is integrated and they use the whole cloth as rags, or they would well it until it got really worn out and then pass it to even poorer people, whom themselves would have worn it until the thing literally disintegrated and it was not even recognizable as what it initially was, whether it be waistcoat, overcoat, whatever. But suddenly with the chromium-based dye, at least the upper classes or even upper middle class started keeping at least some of their outfits that they loved most, even after they could not be worn anymore because they had holes. And that's the reason for which we start finding way more originals from that period onwards. Because a lot more things were actually dyed using the chromium-based dyes, and so we start finding originals from the upper middle class onwards, but usually not from the lower classes, because whether they were chromium-based dyes or not, they would wear those until to turn them into rags, and so which also explains the lack of the majority of classes, the clothing from the majority of classes before 1920, when really things sort of to some degrees has become like today, and there's a ton of clothing. So, having said all that, I explained everything. So now that done, I have to stop talking now. If you are too big, if you have the luck of being short, ideally quite shorter than I would go with the originals, because it will make life easier, because although it is very hard to find originals, it will not be very hard for you because you are short, you are the height of them, so it will not be that hard finding originals that fit and which are valuable. Obviously they will not be a perfect fit, but they will basically fit. They will not look ridiculous on you at all and will not be that uncomfortable. And they will be in a wearable condition. The only problem is if you want if you are very specific with what you want, if you are very specific either on the fit, or if you want something which was out of the norm. So in such a case, you also have, like, if you want to only dress truly like the upper classes, first of all, the fit has to be impeccable, because they had the money to go for bespoke tailoring, whereby the fit is impeccable. So you cannot have an impeccable fit, except if it is your twin brother that did everything like you and is a copy of you. It will never be an impeccable fit. So then it has to be this way. Otherwise, if you do not really care much about the fit, but you want absolutely to, most of the surviving pieces I explained, from the upper middle class onwards, but not what they used to wear every day. Only the most formal outfits survived, because in other words, they were the most formal and the ones that spend the most energy and money crafting, and especially, I think that is my feeling, because they were the most formal, they would have been the outfits like today. People keep the outfits they wear to special occasions, because they are the most formal. They will wear to special occasions, and thus they remember those occasions well, and thus even after the person has died, even after the son of that person has died, even after the son of that person has died, the great-grandson keeps it, not because of historical value. Most people do not care about historical value. They keep it because the person that died, or the son that died, had left a word. That coat had belonged to my father, Ernest, born in 1850, who married my mother, Josephine. I'm making this stuff up. They got married in 1883, and so even the great-grandson, who finds it in 1950, does not care about the historical value. He would have thrown it in the bin, but he keeps it because he finds it well and thinks, damn, that was the wedding sword of my great-grandfather, so it was a special occasion, so I keep it. And so eventually it reaches a point where the sword is 100 years about, and so suddenly people keep it because a bit of the historical value. So even if the paper is lost, they sort of think, wow, I don't know how old is that. I'm going to ask on internet and to stumble on somebody like me who tells them, I created it has historical value, so keep it. So they either keep it or sell it on eBay or give it to a museum. That is how it happened. So that meaning, most of the clothing that has survived, available at least, is not a complete reality. It dates from about the chromium invention. So 1840s really, because the time it really became a massive thing, at least in the Western world, that things were dyed using chromium-based dyes, and suddenly the upper middle class onwards began keeping the outfits that had been worn for special occasions. In other words, not their everyday outfits, but their formal ones. In other words, usually black or dark grey, or at least very dark colored, non-patterned or at most striped for the trousers, maybe, outfits. By that meaning coat, waistcoat, trousers. Usually the other coats have not survived because other coats were more expensive, and except if one was very wealthy. And the very wealthy families are the proper upper class. Usually their descendants, a lot of them would be unwealthy. So for example, I will give an example of how these things have survived, how it happens. I would give a real life example coming simply from my family. I know a lot, and I managed to save all the photographs my grandmother had not thrown before she died. I've put them all in order, they were all over the place. And the oldest one I have is from 1887, and it represents, I think, yes, from 87. I think she was age 7 then. She was born in 1880. The mother of the mother, so I only have a part of my family, which is from my mother's part, and only a part of them even has survived. Basically the wealthiest part. So basically that girl, she was born, I think, in 1880. My mother knows we do not have surviving photographs of her. My mother never saw any photograph of her. She knew that great-grandmother, and that great-grandmother, when she was a kid, because she lived there all, told my mother that was born in 55. I think she died in 65. My mother was 10. She told her that her old mother was very wealthy. She came from a bourgeois, the proper bourgeois family, which meant the owner of a bourg, which was in a sort of petty aristocracy, like almost nobility, like the lowest nobility. So she was literally like a descendant of a true bourg. Of that nobility was, that sort of tiny nobility was created in the Middle Ages, about the probably 14th century. And her father was the descendant of that. He had the bourg under his name. So like a duke would have an entire dukedom, he had like an entire bourg, which is much smaller and part of the city. This is like city nobility of the late Middle Ages, when the feudal system started dying and being replaced by the what eventually became the middle class. But this is sort of in between nobility and middle class, and they were very wealthy. And her own mother was a hat designer. And a very, like, literally hat designer. And a drama happened. She had 3 siblings, all younger than her, all brothers, and there was an epidemic of cholera, I think, something like that, and they all died. So from then on, her mother became mentally, was put into an institution, and the father had to keep on working. So from then on, the family got down. So I'm being upper class, but from my part of the family, I'm from the part of the mother got down basically because she herself married a Jew. It was most likely a Jew that hid it. I think he was a Jew with a lot of wealth, and he made even more wealth selling cigarettes, paper for cigarettes manufacturing. They married in 1900, and I have the wedding picture. That's from 1903, I think, or 1901. 2 years later, the first child, a son, was born called Pierre, like the father. Then their daughter was born. So they only had 2 children. But Pierre literally threw all the money away, and he got them most of it, the inheritance, because he was the eldest and he was a son. And then he literally gambled or the money away. He sold them the mansion they had. And so by the 1950s, everything was lost. And the only way it did not end up on the streets was thanks to Ironically, the father of my mother